Thank you very much, Avellina, for coming back on. You're always a very welcome guest here with the AFFG family in
Thank you so
Glasgow.
much.
And you've been on several times over the past few years, and the last twice you have been speaking about various Scots Loyalists, by which we mean those people who supported Britain in its argument and in its battle with the 13 colonies. And perhaps for the sake of people who didn't see the first two programs with you, you can just bring us a little bit up to speed on what this is about. And before you do that, I should mention that you do have a book, a historical fiction book called All Ye That Pass By. And in that book, you weave together the stories of the people that you've been describing about. And you can get that book by simply searching on Amazon for All Ye That Pass By. Okay. Cool. Well, bring us up to speed, Avellina.
Sure. So the past two episodes, I discussed Major John Pitcairn, who was involved in the early sort of days, or if you will, eve of the American Revolution, kind of, introductory conflict that took place in the Boston area. He was the one who famously said, "Disperse ye rebels," at Lexington, and later at Concord he was involved. And he was mortally wounded at the Battle of Bunker Hill a couple of months later. So we covered him, and he was from Fife in the lowlands of Scotland. And then in the next episode, we covered General Simon Fraser of Balneen, who is a Highland Scot from very prestigious Fraser clan, and he had something of a Jacobite background, but was eventually sort of reconciled to the Hanoverian government, and eventually participates not only in the French and Indian or 7 Years' War, but also in the American Revolution, most famously as part of the top brass under General John Burgoyne in the Saratoga campaign. And so he ended up being mortally wounded at the Second Battle of Saratoga, the Battle of Bemis Heights. And so both of them were very noteworthy Scots who participated in the British Army in the American Revolution. I think many times people forget just how many Scots were involved in the British military. I mean, when you start to think about it, they really did punch above their weight in terms of so many aspects of British life post-Union. And in the American Revolution, they really were, very, very present there. And so I often think of a kind of triumvirate of figures. And it always tends to be Pitcairn, Fraser, and the person we're going to talk about tonight, Major Patrick Ferguson. The three of them really kind of form a kind of a triune unit of the most sort of famous Scots who fought for king and country, fought and died for king and country in this conflict.
Interesting. You mentioned, so tonight's, is it Major Patrick Ferguson, did you say?
Yes.
Where was he from originally, or where was his family from?
So his father was a judge. So he was actually, Patrick Ferguson was born in Aberdeenshire. So technically a Highlander, however, also technically a Lowlander, because the family ends up commuting a ton between Aberdeen and Edinburgh. He identified strongly with Edinburgh, lived and was reared mostly in Edinburgh, also somewhat on his family's estate, which was up in Aberdeenshire in Pitford, which actually was called the Blenheim of the North by some people because of how much it ended up built up. But his father was an interesting character because he had Jacobite sympathies. And he nearly got himself into trouble in different ways because of that. And he was rather famous for defending Jacobites on trial in Carlisle, and also had, according to rumor at the very least, or accusation, had offered to give safe haven, essentially, to refugees fleeing in the aftermath of the Battle of Culloden. So this was kind of part of the reason why he commuted a lot too, between Highlands and the Lowlands. So what you end up with is, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you, but is the reason, maybe you'll get to it, is the reason that the family moved to America is because he wasn't particularly favoured in Scotland
Oh, they didn't.
by the
Sorry, they
by
didn't.
the authorities as a consequence of giving shelter to Jacobites after Culloden?
Well, they didn't actually move to America. Sorry if I explained myself
Oh no,
there.
no, you didn't. You
They
didn't.
Oh, okay. They commuted between the Highlands and the Lowlands of Scotland. So they moved back and forth between Aberdeenshire and Edinburgh a lot. And he kind of dealt with different accusations of Jacobitism. He was a very pious Scottish Episcopalian, his dad, the judge, and had a chapel built at his estate and everything like that. And there was a certain layered complexity here of sort of different brands of Protestantism within Scotland. So you had the Calvinist Presbyterians, and you had the Scottish Episcopalians, were kind of like the Scottish Anglicans of sorts, and there was all sorts of layers to that as well. So within Scottish Episcopalianism, for example, you would have non-jurors who were loyal to the House of Stuart, and felt more akin to Catholics in many ways because they were more high church. And then you would have other Scottish Episcopalians who would indeed take the oaths, the test acts, etc., and so forth. So the dad sort of straddled that line for a while, but he eventually did actually take the oaths, and so forth. So he kind of secured his family that way. But he remained this very kind of, again, pious Episcopalian figure, which stood out from, the Kirk, the Church of Scotland, the Presbyterian end of things. So there was a lot of different ways in which he was sort of setting himself apart from certain groups of people, and he had to be careful with regards to how he presented himself. But he did actually gain quite a lot of renown and quite a lot of respect from people as a judge. So he had a good reputation by the end of everything was said and done. So switching around to our character here of Patrick Ferguson, his son. So something else that is going to be formative in young Patrick's life is the fact that his uncle, General James Murray, was one of the generals, the top brass generals under General James Wolfe at the capture of Quebec. So this was a real leg up for him in terms of getting a military career in his teens, because he had this uncle who was in a prestigious position in the military and who was very involved in Quebec in the aftermath of the actual conquest. So Ferguson, at a young age, gets in with the army, and he sees service in various locations in the course of his early career, including in mainland Europe, and in the Caribbean, and as kind of part of the home guard, if you were, in Britain, dealing with different riots and stuff like that would go down. But then at various points, he would get pulled out of service because of his chronically ill health. The poor kid had just terrible, repetitive health issues. And part of the worst of that was what we think now was a type of tuberculosis, but like bone tuberculosis. So he would have terrible situations with his leg that would become swollen and disfigured and break out in tumors, and it was really nasty stuff. So he had to struggle for much of his youth to try to overcome that kind of ill health that plagued him. It reminds me a bit of, actually, General James Wolfe. He also struggled tremendously with chronic ill health. And, so he really struggled, but he was a plucky guy. Ferguson was a wonderfully plucky character, and he wouldn't, be cowed by his bad health. He kept trying to rise above it, kept trying to really strive to exceed, succeed in his career and get past that kind of ill health. And no matter how much his family fretted for him constantly that the tuberculosis would get into his lungs, and he would die, but he wouldn't give up. trying to get back into the army and get active service. Just repeatedly, he was very, very unwilling to surrender to his own ailments. So yeah.
So bring us to the point then that he gets to America and he ends up fighting.
Sure. Yeah. So what ends up happening is that when the American Revolution breaks out, he does end up in America as part of, you know, the armed forces that were sent to crush the rebellion and try to restore the king's peace. And so he ends up in a number of battles leading up to, you know, just various battles that took place in a lot of the northern states at first. So he was very much in the northern states. It ends up leading up to where he ends up in the south, which is actually more famous. But he was in the north. One of the more famous instances of the north is the Battle of Brandywine, where he had the opportunity to shoot a high-ranking, appearing rebel officer. He was in a position. Oh well, a key thing is that Ferguson was a crack shot. Ferguson was a really good shot. He was a marksman, and he was the inventor of the Ferguson rifle. That's one of the things he's most famous for. He was called a strange adventurer and a man of some genius, and so he was a little bit of a Renaissance man. He did a little bit of it all, from writing poetry to playing the fiddle to creating guns. And so he has this opportunity to shoot this high-ranking officer, but then he gets a conscience strike, if you will, and he doesn't want to do it because the officer is coolly going about his duty. He seems like he has his back turned to him. He doesn't want to do it. He doesn't want to kind of, I think, become what a lot of people were accusing the rebels of doing, which was, you know, really getting into the kind of heavy sharpshooting kind of mentality, especially targeting officers. So he ends up not doing it when he had the opportunity to do it. And later on, somebody told him they believed it was George Washington that he could have almost shot there, but he didn't on a point of conscience. So he ends up in that same battle getting shot in the arm, is terrible injury, gets his arm shattered, and then he ends up laid up in Philadelphia, and he again is getting hit by terrible health, not just the arm, but then the leg starts messing him up again. But he has to have multiple unanesthetic surgeries on the arm to try to save it from being amputated, because this is the whole that they were saying, you know, this arm needs to be amputated, and he's like, no, don't. If that's the case, then I will be forever, you know, taken out of the active service. So he, again, out of this sheer kind of determination and willpower, has it where they, you know, basically do many surgeries, and he manages to save the arm, although it's never really functional again. It's bent at the elbow. And so he ends up after that going on some raids and things like that, which become somewhat controversial because they're surprise attack raids at night, which involve attacking men who at the time of the attack are sleeping. And so some people questioned the honor of that. Ferguson would argue it was more like a commando raid, and that you can't expect, he made like kind of a crack, like you can't expect us to wake them up before attacking. But it was one of those things that got him into some controversy. But one thing that Ferguson was always very consistent on, which I'm just going to read briefly from a quotation from him, was really having a real strong feeling for the protection of non-combatants, for the protection of women and children, etc. So this is just two quotes that paraphrase that, which is always very strong in him, this sort of chivalric streak toward non-combatants. As every man of common humanity must be happy in exerting himself for so virtuous a purpose, you may believe I obeyed his commands, this is General Howe's commands, with diligence and alacrity, and I have the satisfaction of knowing that I have protected a number of innocent families from outrage of other corps, and that not a soldier of my detachment has been detected in marauding whilst under my command. And by God, I will never suffer it, or serve in an army where it is allowed. And again, a similar quote, this to his men. You will pay particular attention to restrain the militia from offering violence to innocent or inoffensive people, and by all means in your power protect the aged, the infirm, the women and children of every denomination from insult and outrage. So he had this strong sense of, again, sort of chivalric treatment towards non-combatants, which was strong in him.
Yes, good.
Yeah. So basically, when he gets rather more, famous down the line, is the Southern campaign. So he ends up in the South to rally the Loyalists. So these were the Americans who were loyal to the crown, loyal to the mother country, did not want to split. They wanted to keep the empire united, and that's why in Canada they get those who are descended from them in Canada get called United Empire Loyalists. The idea was their desire was to keep the empire, keep the Anglosphere united. So he goes down there to rally them. Now the Loyalists had really struggled and suffered a lot on the receiving end of treatment from the rebels, because ultimately, once the rebel governments asserted themselves in various colonies, they would sort of pressure people to be taking oaths to the new government that had been established, and if you didn't, well, any number of things could happen. Your land could be confiscated, your property of all kind could be confiscated, you could be imprisoned, in some cases you're hanged. So they were really struggling, and it created a very violent sectarian cycle down there, especially in the South. It was very, very keen in the South. So Ferguson goes down there, and his goal and his purpose and his mission and the reason he's sent is to rally them and to train them to fight, and to fight back for a king, for country, for their own homes and their own families. And he gives them speeches along those lines that essentially, if you guys don't, figure out how to fight back, then let your women disown you. Which was pretty awesome. So then he turns his attention to the rebels, and he basically says, if you continue to harass us, if you continue to harass the Loyalists, you continue to harass the king's men, I will lay waste to your country with fire and sword. So, this is the thing I will say. I have heard this really bad hot take, in my opinion, that it was because Ferguson said that things went wrong for him. And I'm like, no, I think that he was kind of just saying it like it was, that, you have to kind of push back. He was pushing back. He was there to back his people, and his threats were in defense of his people. So I don't see anything wrong with that. Some people are kind of like, he brought it on himself. I'm like, well, he did exactly what I think was appropriate for someone who was trying to be a defender of, frankly, a defender of Americans who were down there, who needed a defender. But anyway, he could certainly be a bit cocksure at times and make some bad military move decisions. That's true. But at the same time, it was a situation where he needed to, in a way, show bravado in order to encourage his men, get his men willing to fight for themselves. So, you fast forward to the point of King's Mountain. Battle of King's Mountain is a situation where he faces off against what was known as the Over the Mountain Men, these patriot sort of militia forces, essentially, from over the mountain, who cross over to fight Ferguson and his Loyalists. The irony being that almost like loads of people on all sides of this thing are of Scottish ancestry. So many people kind of say this is like a Scot on Scot violence situation breaking out. It definitely was an American on American violence situation, very much so, King's Mountain. Ferguson was one of the only British regulars to be on the mountain. It was very, very small pittance, basically, of actual British regulars involved here. Almost everyone was American Loyalist. And so you have this dramatic fight where Ferguson gets surrounded on the mountain. Even though he got the high point, he got basically still messed up, and ends up being kind of attacked from all sides. So he makes a grand show of it, though, still, even to the end, of riding around, breakneck speed, trying to encourage and rally his men, blowing on his silver signal whistle, which was like his kind of hallmark. and dressed in what I'm wearing right now, which is a plaid jacket over his uniform. And so he makes quite a thank you for whoever said lovely waistcoat. And then so he ends up getting kind of picked off, so to speak, because he's making such a scene of it. But when they try and when his men actually try to raise the white flag, he has a pretty good idea they're not going to get mercy. So he cuts the white flag down and he's like, no, we fight to the end. We're just going to get killed anyway. So they do. And then what ends up happening is that he gets riddled with bullets, basically. He gets shot like 8 to 12 times. And then he gets his leg caught in the stirrup of his horse. And it may have been his bad leg because it's like, his leg gets stiff and you can't easily get it out of the stirrup kind of a situation. So nasty stuff. He ends up going down, gets dragged down the mountain basically with his leg caught in the stirrup. And then at the bottom of the little ridge, some of the patriots come over and one guy tries to take his sword off of what they think is his corpse. And Ferguson, in a last burst of energy, manages to sit up and shoot the guy with his pistol. And then, this just reminds me of the saying of the Macintosh clan, you touch not the cat without the gloved hand. This is one of those situations. But poor Ferguson, he's used his last bullet here, and he doesn't have any means of defense anymore. And so it's pretty awful. He gets beaten and kicked to death by the rebels. And then in the aftermath, like, some horrible stuff happens to his corpse. They basically desecrate his corpse to the point of being unrecognizable, urinate on it, etc. It's really nasty stuff happens, strip it. And then they bury him in a shallow grave. And so legend has it, and this is one of the sort of legends of Kings Mountain business, that he, when trying to sort of rouse his men or rally his men, had made a blasphemous statement, which was, God in heaven and all the rebels from hell couldn't drive me from this mountain. And therefore, this whole tradition starts where people start to put rocks on the grave. It's a little weird, and there are a bunch of different theories on how this began. It's like the logic, you're trying to hold him from the judgment day, keep him on the mountain, or is it like, I don't know. I'm a little confused on it, but basically it's supposed to be something to do with that sort of statement where they're kind of rubbing it in that he isn't getting off the mountain, like he got what he wished for, and kind of something like that. It's become a tradition. One thing I would say about, in wrap of the whole thing about the blasphemous thing. Now, Paddy, this is what his family and friends call him. So Paddy could certainly work his mouth. He had an irreverent sense of humor at times. But one thing I think people are wrong about, and I've run into a number of people who kind of latch on this story and a few other things and say that, oh, well, he kind of represents this sort of flippant irreligiosity, is that in his letters, you can just tell that's not actually strictly the case. When he's actually being serious, if he's not making a joke or maybe trying to hype some people up in the moment, he actually seems like he inherited quite a bit of his dad in him. In terms of, he actually mentions God a ton in his letters in a positive way too, in a reverential way. So that's not a good representation of him. And he actually has one very, very lovely quote, I think, which I think is a better way to kind of give a nod to the man. And I think the way he'd rather be remembered, frankly, than if not he made a sort of a blasphemous statement. And it's, the length of our lives is not at our own command, however much the manner of them may be. If our Creator enable us to act the part of men of honor and to conduct ourselves with spirit, probity, and humanity, the change to another world, whether now or 50 years hence, will not be for the worst.
Well, do you know what, Avellina? I think that's a fantastic way to end your tale there of what I'm going to call the legend of Kings Mountain.
Yeah, pretty much.
Major Patrick Ferguson, a name that is totally unknown, of course, in Scotland. And indeed, not just the name, but the whole conflict of the Scots and the British in the British Army, but also the Americans who sided with the British,
Oh yeah,
which we're
it's my
calling
solidarity. It's my solidarity vest. It's my solidarity vest as a royalist American here. He's a hero to us.
Well, exactly. And I just wish there were more loyalists around. When we were on the street stall, actually on Saturday, a Canadian fellow came up to us and said that he was a loyal Canadian and he was over on holiday. So who knows, maybe he was, well, he possibly was descended from the loyalists, what you mentioned, they're called the United Empire Loyalists, who left America after the end of the revolution, which is to say after when it ended in 1783, who made their way to Canada and who founded the great British nation of Canada. So Avellina, what I'm going to do is say thank you very much. Now, people who want your book, which is a historical tale based around this whole time period, what you need to do is search Amazon, All Ye That Pass By. That's available on Amazon.com
for record,
.co.uk.
And for also, record, Major Patrick Ferguson shows up as a character in the trilogy in book 3. So he'll be coming round the mountain, so to speak.
Right. And also go to your YouTube, which is youtube.com/@ Avellina Balestri, AVELLINA BALESTRI, for the benefit of the people listening to the audio podcast. So Avellina, thank you once more very much for your dissertation. You're the go-to historian, I think, for American loyalism. At least that seems to be the row that you are cultivating for yourself, and look forward to.
I do my best. I do my best. I feel like it's a matter of keeping faith with those who have gone before. So it's something that is important to me. And yeah, no, I'd love to. Maybe next time, now that we finished off the triumvirate, something I think would be really cool to do would be General Edward Braddock from the French and Indian War, who may have been born in Perthshire. So him and Sir Peter Halket, who was close to him in that Braddock's March Monongahela battle, was also a Scot. So I feel like we could do French and Indian Scots.
I think that we should. Avellina, thanks very much for talking about Patrick Ferguson. We'll wish you goodbye and look forward to seeing you next time around.
You too. Thank you so much, Alistair. You have a great day. God bless.
Cheers.